Yeah,
Beautifully
it's on the top there. It's renowned as one of the best movies ever made, isn't it? You know,
Yeah,
as you
it's
say.
beautifully lit. It's like, it's a
Beautiful.
film
Film
noir.
noir. Yep.
It's really, I love it. I love it. We watched it together, and she quit halfway through. She goes, "The dialogue is terrible. The acting is wooden." It's
How
like,
how
"What?"
dare she? How
I know,
dare! Oh,
I know, and there's
divorce the
nothing
divorce proceedings are on the way.
I know, there's nothing I can say, to sway your opinion, but fine. But it actually proves the point that you made earlier, um, we're different, and some people put the emphasis on different things. They're looking out for different things, and
Really?
this is I
Yeah.
think this is what makes, creative endeavors like music, like film, or like photography so amazing because it creates that incredible variety of things that, some people like to create incredible macro flower images, you know, and other people don't really care very much about flowers like myself. But,
Well, it's but nevertheless though, I mean, I do I think you should photograph if you should try photograph everything. I photograph flowers with
yeah,
macro, and I love it. There's nothing more meditative, than
yeah,
going around to my local park and photographing the flowers, you know, especially with, like,
yeah,
different light and hard contrast light or soft light.
yeah.
And yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's funny this, I mentioned earlier, I used to rebel, against my grandmother and my dad. So my grandmother shot in black and white exclusively, back in the 30s and 40s. And my dad, well, my dad shot both black and white and color, but all film, obviously, back in those days.
Of course.
And I remember I grew up and I used to think throughout the 80s, I used to think like, oh, black and white. Who shoots black and white? What was the whole point in this? It's like where color's been invented. What's the point in shooting black and white, right? And I tell you what, until the first Gulf War.
Oh,
And so what happened during the first Gulf War was that I used to live in Germany at the time, and in Germany, cable television and stuff existed, but my parents didn't have it, right? My parents just had like 3 basic TV channels. They were not interested in getting cable or whatever. I don't think you had satellite TV back then, but, like, they weren't
well,
interested
yeah,
in cable TV.
similar story to the UK really, you know, of course, we didn't, we only had one channel up till the 1980s.
Yeah,
Bit more
and
than that.
so, these 3 channels was all that we had. Um And of course, on those 3 channels, because they were like public broadcasters, they would stop broadcasting at about, I don't know, 1 AM or something, and then this plate would come up and, it would start again at, I don't know, 5:30 in the morning or something, um, until the first Gulf War. And during that time, they would run a news bulletin every hour, just an update, right, all through the night. And so
Mhm.
they would
Yeah.
fill up the time in between with
Yes.
classic movies, with classic black and white
Oh,
movies. Like
okay.
all the old MGM stuff, the David Niven stuff, all of that, all of these, the pendulum of death or whatever it is, like the whole shebang, um, all of the old Paramount stuff. Because I think all of that stuff, which I've recently learned, all of that stuff was out of licensing or whatever, out of copyright. So they
Oh, I
basically just
see, so they could show it.
they could just show it,
Mm.
and this all happened right in the middle of the school holidays. And I was like, "Whoa, okay. I'm, like, totally gonna stay up all night and watch TV," you know? And once I started doing that, I really got into those black and white movies, and I've loved black and white movies ever since, and especially that time period, it just has a special sort of place in my heart. I just love the look of it. I like the really tinny audio. I just love it. It's like there's
Oh,
something.
okay, you should okay, that's quite a fetish you've got there,
Oh,
I see, the
absolutely. Yeah,
audio.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of it works, with the whole thing because, often, they weren't like, a lot of the time, they weren't as sharp as we would
Mm.
expect, especially from the early 30s, like late
Of
20s,
course.
early 30s, things weren't quite as sharp. Um, the audio was obviously very tinny back then, given how they recorded stuff. The acting was very theater, quite like very like, what's the word? Very boxy and like,
Yeah.
not like
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
so this was still the early days of film, basically, in a sense. But I just loved it. I loved the storylines. There wasn't a lot of action. A lot of it was exposition. A lot of it was just dialogue. Because a lot of those movies were shot on sound stages, with sometimes with no on
Right.
location work or whatever. And so they had to tell a story much like you would do in a theater, on different sets essentially. And I really fell in love with those movies. So yeah. So and now, of course, I love shooting black and white. There you go. It's come full circle.
Did you shoot black and white film, or do you just convert it digitally?
So I do shoot black and white film. So that's something I do not professionally, but I love doing it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but I also started mimicking that on digital. Um, but I turned the whole workflow into black and white. So although I shoot raw, um, the entire workflow is in black and white. So what I see through the viewfinder is black and white. What pops up on my screen, so do shoot tethered, is also black and white.
Yes. I see, you should
Um,
have it
and so the entire workflow is black and white.
black and white. I got it. Like those Leica black and white cameras, which are very odd.
Yeah, a little bit like that, but it's basically because, and I know, I've spoken to many photographers who basically shoot, normal inverted commas and then convert into black and white afterwards. I see the point. There's no problem with that for me at all. It's just
Yeah.
I like to
It
see the image in black and white when I
no,
look through the
totally.
viewfinder.
Totally. I get that
So
totally. Yeah, yeah, for sure. And well, it's great that you're doing film as well, so you can compare the 2, because I think often people, unless you've been involved in a darkroom and seeing, and understanding contrast and understanding maybe even the zone system or whatever, or different papers, there's a lot to learn, and it's not just a question of desaturating it, is now it's black and white.
yeah, and that's exactly it. And he light things. So this is the thing I've learned, and I'm by no means, you know, I'm no George Horrell, but um I just I light things differently when I see them in black and white. This is
Yes.
that's
Yes.
the thing. So,
Yes. You can do.
um,
Definitely. 100%.
so
Yeah.
it's just to me that's why it makes sense for me is to keep that whole workflow in black and white.
It's
Now,
a sh sorry, just before on that black and I mean, I'm surprised black and white photography, even though people love black and white photography. I remember I did a LinkedIn post about this, how people like, but they were never black and white portraits or black and white business, or for my branding world, is just not really requested or done really, which is a bit of a
yes,
shame, I think. I think there's a bit of a, I'm hoping one day to do a black and white photo shoot for somebody. I'm sure I will do.
yeah. I've only ever really sold one black and white headshot, I have to say,
That's right,
and
exactly. Yeah.
it worked in this particular context. It perfectly worked. It was a CEO of a company. It was a pinstripe suit. Um, it's a very sharp shot. It worked 100%. It was perfect. It had a classic, timeless um, vibe to it.
Well, it's
And
evocative, isn't it? That is it. Black and white is so evocative. It's so,
yeah,
and people do love it. They say, "Oh, I love black and white," but yes, but for the commercial world or the business world, it's not quite crossed over there yet. Yeah.
yes, yeah. Well, one can only hope. Okay, this is your trends. Trends. Let's start a new
Exactly. There
trend.
you go. That's a good point.
Um, so how do you guide clients um to make them feel comfortable when you're shooting them, especially when you're shooting people who are not necessarily used to being photographed. Like let's say a business owner who needs branding photography for their business. What's your process to make people feel relaxed and natural in front of the camera?
Yeah, that's another good question. When I used to, I said earlier, I was a fashion photographer, and so obviously, um, people are being paid to be photographed. I mean, and part of the business, and model was a job that, and they wanted to be photographed. When I started getting to doing branding photography, and I was quite surprised that people didn't want to be photographed. I thought, you don't want to be photographed? What is that? So I was first of all quite shocked over it. Once I got over that, I sort of developed these 3 techniques, and I guess what we're talking about here is posing people, isn't it? Really, for want of a better word. I'm not very keen on that word, but let's just go with that. And, I've developed this 3-part system. Um, Let me see if I can remember what it is now. We got there's mirroring, observation, and I think a third one is empathy. Mirroring is basically, one I got from, do you remember Richard Avedon did that book called The American West, of those beautiful portraits of, that he did that were like 6 foot and were shown in a gallery back in the 1970s and 80s. He talked, I went to go to his archive over in Fort Worth in Texas when I was working there once. And they keep all his notes about how he did the shoots and so on and so forth. And he talks about how he would get these people who weren't models, um, and he would basically get them to pose in a certain way by like crossing his arms, and he had such an empathy with them that they would cross their arms as well. Or he'd tilt his head and they tilt their head in the same way as well. So that's without people realizing it, you can get them to do what you want by doing those things. So that's mirroring.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that clip, then press here for the full episode in glorious Technicolor. Hey, and don't forget to subscribe.